Hey everyone, welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. We are in the book of Romans. We've been in there for a couple of days now. We're in Romans 3, verses 1 through 8, and we're going to look at where Paul talks about the God remaining faithful. And again, this is Romans 3, 1 through 8. So we'll look at this real quick and hit a little bit of the notes here. This is a little bit shorter of section than some of the other ones we've been doing. But he says in verse 1, he said, then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Now, I'll start this by saying, yesterday he talks about the Jews and the law, and, talking about how, there's going to be some Gentile people who, are uncircumcised but still follow law are going to be better off than some of the Jewish people. And so he's like, what's the advantage, right? Well, then if that's the case, then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Is there any value in the ceremony of circumcision? Yes, there are great benefits. First of all the Jews were entrusted with the whole revelation of God. True, some of them were unfaithful, but just because they were unfaithful, does that mean God will be unfaithful? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. As the scriptures say about him, you will be proved right in what you say, and you will win your case in court. Verse 5 says, but some might say our sinfulness serves as a good purpose, for it helps people see how righteous God is. Isn't it unfair then for him to punish us? This is merely a human point of view. Of course not. If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge the world? But someone might still argue, how can God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? And some people even slander us by claiming that we say, the more we sin, the better it is. Those who say such things deserve to be condemned. And so, kind of a highlight or a common thought or train of thought was like, well, if the more we sin, the more it shows God's glory, and the more it highlights how wonderful God is. Well, shouldn't you keep on sinning? It was basically an excuse to keep on sinning. And Paul's like, may it never be. Of course not, right? And so then the question then he asks is, when he going back to the beginning of this, is what's the advantage of being a Jew? And Paul, he's moving his argument along by raising some of these questions, and I think here, after preaching the good news, preaching the gospel at this point, and it's hard to think about, and because sometimes we don't see the timeline as much as we go through this, but at this point, Paul had been teaching the gospel for about 20 years. We don't realize that because we read through Acts and we read through some of the letters, and it's like, oh well, it's been a couple years. No, it's actually been 20 years now that Paul's been preaching the gospel, and he knew what questions people were going to ask, and when they heard a particular teaching, right? He'd probably heard this many times, and so his emphasis on the equality of Jews and Gentiles before God would have inevitably led people to ask whether he was eliminating all Jewish privilege. And the advantage of being Jews here possess what is having received God's word. And so they were the first ones. They were the first ones to receive the true revelation of God. And so they had the advantage here. And now Paul says in the start of this, he says first of all. Now, he never adds a second or third point in the list here. Now, maybe he'd forgotten to continue his list as he was writing, or what I think he probably meant here was, instead of saying first of all, meaning first of all, he was saying, I think what he was trying to say was most importantly, right? Most importantly, instead of first of all. But, even if he wasn't, we're going to hit, when we hit chapters 9, verses 4 and 5, it's going to provide a good indication of a list, right? Of some of the Jewish privileges that would be included. And so I don't think he was starting a list. This is Chad's personal opinion here. Again, I could be wrong. I don't think he was starting a list, first, second, third, of all. I think what he was saying when this was translated as first of all, I personally think he was saying most importantly, right? So this is the first, this is the most important thing. And so then he says, of course not, right? When talking about sinning, to highlight, right, this, the Greek word here is an emphatic negation. It was popular style, and Paul's use there is popular. He uses it several other times in Romans, and the passage saying. So he's saying, of course not, right? Of course not. This is not. We should not try to sin in order to highlight how God's grace and how good God is, and to show His. That's not what we should be doing. And so he goes on to then say, as the scriptures say, and this is he quotes here. Psalms 51 verse 4, which is the Greek version here, where David confesses his sin in having an adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, and so God punishes David for that, and David admitted that God was proven right and would win his case in court. His punishment was entirely just. Everything that happened to David, even though it was bad, right? It was a hard punishment. David was saying, "Look, you were justified in it. You were right." And so he's, David was saying that his punishment was entirely just for what he did. And so God is faithful to what he has said in the past, right? His entire revelation and his word warns of punishment for the sin, even as they promise a reward for obedience. And so that's things like, and there's going to be some other areas where Paul talks about this, right? Well, shouldn't we sin more, right? If God's grace is proven and shown, the more we sin, the more it shows God's grace. Well, then shouldn't we keep on sinning more? And Paul's like, no, that's not the way that this works. And then it's like, no, we should not do that. We should do our best to be sinful, but it still does. God's grace is still highlighted because of our sinfulness, and how much mercy and grace He shows us. But no, we should not keep doing that. And so, and then the question that Paul raises, that some people argue, is how would he be qualified to judge the world? And how is God qualified to judge the world? And Abraham asked a similar question, right? Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right? In Genesis 18:25. And the simple fact is, God punishes all sin, and He retains absolute righteousness as He does so. And this is the thing, we see that Christ lived a perfectly righteous life on earth, and God is perfectly righteous, and He still punishes all sins, and He allows sin. He still forgives sin, right? He shows His grace and mercy in forgiving sin, but He still remains righteous when doing so. And this is His thing, and this is the interesting thing, and then maybe, I don't know, we'll get a full understanding of how this works. Like, even when God makes use of human sin, right, for His own ends. I mean, you think about it, like the crucifixion, the all these things. You read through the Old Testament, God has used the sinfulness of man to basically, you know, work out His will to do things, and so that sin, even though God uses that sin to make His will happen, that still deserves to be and will be punished. And again, like, that can be a hard thing to wrap your mind around. It's like, okay, God allowed people to sin, and He used their sinfulness to nail His Son to a cross. And it's like, well, why would He allow that to happen? Well, He allowed it to happen so that all those sins could be forgiven. And I think sometimes this is hard for us to wrap our minds around. I mean, it truly is. You think about it, God's sovereign, but God's given us free will, so we can choose to sin, but yet God's still going to use our sinfulness and those sins to make sure that His will is completed. And so, a lot of people say, well, that's God, allowing sin. Well, yeah, technically God did allow sin, right? He allowed it because He gave us free will, right? He gave us the option to choose, and we choose sinfulness, right? But He still forgives us, and gives us an opportunity to be forgiven of those sins, and He uses that sin to be able to allow us. And so it's kind of like a circle that we look at, and so it can be hard to understand sometimes. I think that how that works, and we're not God, and I'm not God, and we're never going to fully understand, I think, a lot of this until we get to heaven. But yes, God allowed sinfulness to happen. God allowed the world to fall into sin, because if He didn't, then we'd just be a bunch of robots running around, and that's not true followers. But yet He still uses that to His advantage. Uses that to be able to see His will end, and and make sure what He needs to happen happens. And so, yeah, He can work in our sinfulness to make His will happen as well. And so. And then Paul continues on and says, some people will slander us. Paul is referring to the misrepresentation about his teachings on justification by faith, which, basically saying, if we're justified by faith and not by works, right? And the more we sin, the more God's grace is shown, then should we not keep on sinning? Again, he's going to reference this before, right? And so if a person's made right with God by faith alone, through God's grace and apart from works, it could seem, right, as if the good news allows believers to sin because their sin is forgiven when confessed. And and that's the thing, is like, oh well, it can encourage people. And Paul's like, no, no, right? One of Paul's purposes to help the Christians understand that such misunderstandings are without basis, and that's what part of what he's writing. Hey, this is not how we should do. Just because our sins are forgiven, and it shows God's grace and how wonderful it is, does not mean we should keep on sinning and purposely, for sure, in order to continue to show and enhance and show how wonderful, gracious God is. No, that's not. That's not what we're called to be. And if you're a true believer and you have true faith, then you'll understand that that is not how we're to live. And so that's kind of how he wraps that up. And in this whole section, he's just letting them know that God, and through all this, God remains faithful. God remains perfect. He uses our imperfections, our sinfulness, for his will to happen. But in the end, God is still God and ruler of all. And so then he's going to continue on. We'll look at this tomorrow, on how all people are sinners, right? And continue this train of thought going forward. And again, like I said, some of this can be is deep. Some of this is as we dive into it, man. Like I've said before, even Peter said, Paul, some of our writings can be confusing, and I hope this isn't the case. I'm trying to clear this up some as we get into it. But again, these are deep thoughts. These are deep thoughts that Paul is getting into with the Roman Church, and again, it can take time to read over and over again to help get a better and more thoughtful understanding of what you're reading. And so I encourage that. But again, I hope this is helpful. I hope that it helps clear some of this up, and helps you get a better understanding of what Paul is writing about here in the Rome and to the Roman Church as they continue on. As always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, I encourage you to do so, so you get these. You can read along with us daily, study the Bible with us daily, and dive a little bit deeper daily. As always, like I said, appreciate everyone who makes comments, has questions, those kind of things, shares this. It really does help get our message out. But as always, thank you for watching, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.